everyone. Wayne Motts, the President Emeritus and Historian at the Gettysburg Foundation, in a very special place for a very special video with Dan Vermilya, Park Ranger at the Eisenhower National Historic Site. Dan, welcome to our video, and we want to thank you for spending your time out here with us. You know, everybody always asks me what the favorite place on the battlefield is, and I always say the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, bar none. I think people would find that surprising. The sacrifice and the stories here are tremendous, and informationally today we've got some interesting things planned here for a couple highlights of men who are buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. So we're going to spend time today talking about men connected with D-Day. How's that? How's that sound? Okay.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Thank you, first of all, Wayne, and thank you to the Gettysburg Foundation for joining us for this. We do get questions about, why are there D-Day and World War II stories here in Gettysburg National Cemetery? As a national cemetery for years after the Civil War, even after the U.S. fallen from Gettysburg were buried here, this was still a burial ground for our nation's fallen, for veterans as well as those who served and died while serving their country in later conflicts. There are soldiers buried here who served the United States from the Civil War all through Vietnam. And for World War II, it's a very special chapter of this cemetery story. In the years after World War II, the United States government sent out questionnaires to the next of kin of fallen U.S. soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, asking them where they wanted their loved ones to be buried. And over 171,000 families chose to have their loved ones brought home to the United States. And they could select cemeteries. Gettysburg was selected by over 500 families as a burial ground. Wow. So from 1947 to 1951, there were soldiers buried here who were casualties of the Second World War. And I think it certainly only adds to the illustrious history and the solemn nature of this cemetery that you have on the same hillside where President Lincoln spoke in November of 1863, speaking about freedom and the great task remaining before us, that you have generations of Americans who served in sacrifice in pursuit of that great task of defending and even expanding the freedoms that this country preserves and enjoys. So some tremendously solemn and appropriate stories here as we think about the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion of Normandy, France.
Yeah, and we've got so many stories, folks, that could be told here. Behind every stone is a story.
Yeah.
And so we're just grateful that Dan could spend a little bit of time with us today to tell us some of these very moving and important stories related to the Second World War. So Dan, why don't you start out?
Sure. So we're here at the headstone of William Henry Schreiber. He's the first service member we're going to be talking about today. If you look at William's headstone here, his date of death is April 28th of 1944. So you might be wondering, how is this young man connected to the events of D-Day, which happened weeks after he died? Well, not all those who died as a result of D-Day died on June 6th of 1944. This was a massive undertaking, the Allied invasion of mainland Europe. There were months and months and years of planning that went into this, but in the weeks and months just prior to the invasion, as preparations were ramping up, there's a number of training exercises, especially in England, which was this massive staging ground for U.S. personnel for this vast Allied force that our very own General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be leading. Well, William Henry Schreiber was a native of North Braddock, Pennsylvania. He left Turtle Creek High School in 1943 to enlist in the United States Navy. He did so with the permission of his parents because he was only 16 years old at the time. His father was an immigrant from Central Europe, so William was fighting for his father's adopted country in World War II. William served on LST 507, which was one of the thousands of ships involved in the Normandy invasion. And in late April of 1944, LST 507 was part of something called Exercise Tiger, which was essentially a large practice run at landing troops on Utah Beach. They had a beach in England designated as a stand-in for Utah Beach. And on the early morning hours of April 28th, 1944, a German torpedo boat, or several German torpedo boats, came upon this column of American LSTs and landing craft that were doing this practice run. This was about 2 in the morning, and several of the ships were hit. There were explosions. There were hundreds of casualties. On William's ship alone, LST 507, there were over 200 killed when the ship went down in the early morning hours of April 28th. Of all the tragedy of this with William's story, he had turned 17 years old the day before. He turned 17 on April 27th, and in the early morning hours of April 28th, he's killed during this training exercise, Exercise Tiger, preparing for the landings on Utah Beach, preparing for the coming invasion of mainland Europe. And it's a story that we're trying to tell and highlight more, to bring awareness to, because while there are 13 soldiers buried here who were killed on June 6th of 1944, 13 D-Day casualties, there are others buried here as well who have direct connections with those events of D-Day, and we want to find a way to honor their stories, especially that of Seaman Second Class William Henry Schreiber.
Yeah. So Dan, you just presented a training casualty for Exercise Tiger, I think you called it, and that was in preparation for June 6th, and you mentioned that there were probably a dozen or 13 men that died on June 6th, and that's going to be a profile for our next person that you want to talk about. So why don't you tell us?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're standing here at the headstone and the grave of Joseph Fetish, Tech 5 Joseph Fetish. Of the 13 D-Day casualties here in Gettysburg National Cemetery, 12 of them were soldiers, sailors, or service members who died on Omaha Beach, probably the more famous of the American landing beaches, the two American landing beaches. Joe Fetish here served with the 4th Infantry Division, 4th Infantry designated for Utah Beach. So he is our lone Utah Beach casualty buried here. We thought his story would be fitting to share with everyone today. Joe Fetish was with Battery B of the 29th Field Artillery Battalion within the 4th Infantry Division. And he was a native of the Wilkes-Barre area here in Pennsylvania. And growing up, he was quite literally a Boy Scout. He served in the Boy Scouts. The local papers talked about his accolades, his various badges and awards he won, even mentioned that he took part in a big snowball fight with his fellow scouts one cold wintry day. When he joined up, he actually enlisted in 1940 at the age of 17 years old, and he listed as his occupation semi-skilled production of bakery products, which I think is a really interesting way of saying that he was a baker prior to enlisting. But he served with, as I noted, the 4th Infantry Division. He was on a landing craft coming aboard carrying M7 priests. He was the driver of one of these armored vehicles coming ashore to Utah. And at about 8:20 in the morning on June 6, 1944, his ship struck a mine just off Utah Beach in the English Channel. And for his battery, Battery B, there were 60 casualties. 2/3 of the battery's casualties in the entire war came in that moment when they struck the mine off of Utah Beach. And his body was recovered from the choppy surf of the English Channel shortly thereafter. So Joseph Fetish is our lone Utah Beach story here in Gettysburg National Cemetery. And it's appropriate to share because it's a reminder that while Omaha Beach has been popularized with pop culture, countless books written on it, there were multiple American landing beaches and multiple other British and Canadian landing beaches as well. So we'd like to share Joseph's story. When word arrived in his hometown of his death, there was a 3-day public display of flags. And every year for Memorial Day, when there's flags placed at the headstones here in the cemetery, I always think about that in connection with Joseph and how those in his hometown chose to remember him.
So Dan, you've covered 2 D-Day related deaths here, one in Exercise Tiger, one on Utah Beach. And now we want to cover a third man, which is this man right here. Why don't you give us some information about him?
Correct, yes. This is the headstone and grave of William Charles Latham. He was a staff sergeant in Company B of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, famous Blue-Gray Division, fighting on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. William is one of 5 members of the 116th Infantry Regiment who were killed on Omaha Beach, who are buried here in Gettysburg National Cemetery. Company A came ashore first, suffered very, very heavy losses. Company B with William came ashore about 30 minutes later. William was struck as he was arriving there, killed very early on in the fight on Omaha Beach. Growing up, he worked as a tannery laborer alongside his father in North Bend, Pennsylvania. And one of the things about William's story that always stands out to me is that he played for a baseball team in his hometown, And before he enlisted and joined the U.S. Army, he had a tryout with the St. Louis Cardinals.
Wow.
There is a quote from Stephen Ambrose about how these men of D-Day, these young men of D-Day. William here died the day after his 24th birthday. So we talked about William Schreiber, died the day after his 17th birthday.
Oh.
William here turned 24 years old on June 5th of 1944. So he died the next morning. But there's a Stephen Ambrose quote about these young men, because these are young men, how they didn't want to be doing this. They would have rather been throwing baseballs than hand grenades. And when I hear that quote or see that quote from Stephen Ambrose and his work on D-Day, William's story always comes to mind, because he was quite literally a baseball player. And he had to be pretty good to get a tryout with the St. Louis Cardinals, I think. But instead of throwing baseballs for the St. Louis Cardinals, he was fighting for the United States in the Second World War, and he gave his life on Omaha Beach.
One of the many stories here, and we can't reiterate enough that as you walk through the National Cemetery, there are so many stories, not just Civil War related. You just heard 3 that are in this cemetery related to the Second World War and related to June 6, 1944. And Dan, we understand out at Eisenhower National Historic Site, we're coming up on the 80th anniversary. It's hard to believe.
Yeah.
80 years
Yeah.
since D-Day, June 6, 1944, and the Eisenhower National Historic Site is doing some special things for this particular commemoration. Why don't you tell the viewers a little bit about it?
So we do have several days of special programs planned. On June 6th, we're hosting a naturalization ceremony welcoming new citizens at Eisenhower National Historic Site. I think it's a very appropriate and fitting way to remember the day, to honor what these men fought and died for, which was citizenship and democracy and the rights of others. So we're commemorating the day with a naturalization ceremony at General and Mrs. Eisenhower's home. We're also doing several days of guided walking tours of Gettysburg National Cemetery, focusing on the World War II stories here. On June 6th, we have a tour focusing on D-Day burials in the cemetery. On June 7th, we're having a walking tour focusing on air war stories of World War II, casualties of the air war who are buried here in this cemetery. And June 8th, we have a tour focusing on other 1944 casualties buried here, both from the European and Pacific theater of operations. We'll have several days of house tours going on, open house style tours of the Eisenhower home, where visitors can come out and tour the house between the hours of 10 and 3 or 10 and 4, depending on the day. And several special programs. We're debuting our D-Day Battlefield in a Box program for the 80th anniversary, a special program where visitors get a chance to work with a ranger to lay out a map of the D-Day landings, and also hosting some living history at Eisenhower National Historic Site on June 8th and June 9th. All of this is listed on our website, so we'd encourage folks to go there for a schedule of programs. And all of this is tied into the theme of service and sacrifice, understanding these men who served and sacrificed 80 years ago, so that we have the ability to commemorate these things, to welcome in new citizens to our country, to enjoy beautiful national parks and beautiful places like this in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
We just can't thank you enough for being here, telling these very moving and important stories for the history of the United States. And no matter how many times you've been to Gettysburg, everybody, get yourself to the Eisenhower National Historic Site. Don't forget, we've got 2 national parks at Gettysburg. We don't just have one. So get yourself over to visit the Eisenhower National Historic Site. Look at the website for all the details that Dan just mentioned. I want to thank Sarah behind the camera from the Gettysburg Foundation. And Dan, we really appreciate your time for these important stories related to a watershed event, a seminal event in the history of the United States, June 6, 1944, and in the history of the world. No question about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne.